All right, so this Knife Thoughts video is going to be a look at another one of the Rough Ryder Reserve knives. And before I get started here, I want to just first of all thank Darren Orrell for loaning this knife. I didn't get all three of the versions that have come out of the Rough Ryder Reserve line of knives yet, and Darren offered to send this to me for review, as well as another knife, this Albert's Cutlery knife. So keep an eye out for that. And big thanks to Darren. He is another moderator and administrator of the Gradius Cutlery Club group on Facebook, and a big part of the Blade Forums traditional sub forum. So definitely really grateful for the opportunity to check this out. And let's take a look at it. So as you can see, this is the RRR002. So this is the second in the series. I always have trouble opening these boxes. I wanted to show you the box, but I don't want to ruin the box. And I have trouble getting them to open without ruining these flaps here. So hopefully I'll be able to get it open in not too much time. There we go. But it's the second in the series, and this is what they call the Kayak. Just like the first in the series, which is the one I got and have a video on, it comes in a tube. And I'm going to talk about some of the maybe comparisons in the industry or in the market a little bit more later. But if you're a fan of GEC, you probably are familiar with the idea of a knife coming in a tube. But the Rough Ryder Reserves have a nice little foam thing to keep it secure in there. Does have a desiccant packet, and then it's kind of like double wrapped here. Has a nice microfiber cloth, and then the wax paper, and the wax paper and the microfiber cloth both have the Rough Ryder Reserve branding. So let's take a look at the knife. So this Kayak model, it's called the Kayak because it is kind of a take on the Canoe, a more modern or modified take on the Canoe pattern. And it is a really interesting knife. It's one of the more interesting of the three knives that came out so far on this series. And that is because it is kind of a modified or modernized version of the Canoe. So first of all, let's take a look at it. As you can see, it's an equal end pattern with raised bolsters, and it does have a swell center here. But what I would probably consider the main blade, because it's on the top when the shield is on the front, is kind of a reverse Tonto. Now, in the advertising, they said that both edges were straight, but this edge definitely has a little bit of a curve to it. And I'm happy about that, actually, because I like that, because the other blade is straight. It's nice to have a curved edge and a straight edge. So as you can see, it has some swedging. It has a very slight curve to it, and then the cutoff here for that reverse Tonto blade shape. Let's see how well it'll focus. Nice polishing on both sides. Rough Ryder has kind of established that they like using this match strike nail nick, and these Rough Ryder Reserves have that also. Some people really like it, some don't. I'm kind of ambivalent. And let's take a look at the second blade. Second blade is also kind of a reverse Tonto, but it does have pretty much a straight edge. It's maybe like a coping, Wharncliffe, modified coping, Wharncliffe type blade. Has this cutoff. It's a little bit more abrupt of a cutoff. Doesn't have as much, if any, curve to the edge, and a little bit straighter here on the back, kind of a downward turn. So it's a little bit of an unusual blade shape, especially for a traditional knife. I would say it's probably closest to a coping blade, but it's a little bit thicker or taller than a coping blade typically is. So an interesting blade shape combination. I do like, as I said, the fact that one has a little bit of a curve to it and the other is straight. This one also has some drawn swedging, as you can see. And the other thing you probably notice, they have a really nice snap. So they do have half stops, and they snap open and to half stop and to closed really nicely. I would call these pulls maybe a 6, a little bit stronger than your typical medium-sized Swiss Army knife, but very manageable in my opinion, and nice and snappy. and very smooth also. And one of the first things I want to talk about the construction on this knife is what probably brings a lot of that smoothness, and that is the fact that, I hope you can see it here, yeah, you can kind of see in there, these knives, these Rough Rider Reserve knives, are actually on washers. And it's something you do see on custom traditional knives, handmade traditional knives. You can see right in there those, what I believe are phosphor bronze washers. It is something you see on custom traditional knives, but not very much on production traditional pocket knives, except for one company that I've seen. And I think it's probably the best comparison to these Rough Rider Reserves. I even wonder if they aren't made by the same, original manufacturer, but we'll get into that in a second here. So it does come on washers, and it has pin construction. It's not a screw construction knife like some modern slip joints. I do like the pin construction. They're all flush, which if you are familiar with GEC, you know that often the cover pins are not flush. And I do think that the flush pins look nice. It has this arrow shield, which Smoky Mountain Knife Works has a whole write-up on the history of this. I'll put that up here, and you can pause it if you would like to read that. But it's something that they have been using apparently, and have been, the owner has been interested in Native American artifacts and the like for a while. So it's not maybe a direct inspiration from Northwood's knives, as some people might have suggested or did suggest. Now, one thing that I was a little bit disappointed with, and this is one of those things that I'm very, hard line on this, I prefer pin shields. I was really hoping, especially at this price point, it would have been awesome if these shields were pinned, and they're not. So I'll show you. This is the pin here, and then there's no pin corresponding with the shield. So honestly, I'm not surprised, but I do wish that they had pinned. I think at this price point, they would have been it would have been really great to see them be pinned. It would have been unusual and something that would have given them an edge over another manufacturer. Not pin shield, but otherwise the construction is really nice. The shield is actually fit pretty well. You can see there's no big gaps. Like I said, the pins are fit well. The covers are really nicely fitted. There's really no gaps between the covers and the bolsters. The bolsters are kind of a brushed finish and nicely done. There's no gaps at all, which is really surprising, really kind of amazing, especially given the competition at this price point. So really no gaps there. And like I said, great action and no blade plate either. Really just a nicely constructed, nicely fitted knife. So cool. It's definitely something that is well made, and if you like the design, an interesting pattern. I personally do like the design. I like the blade shape combination. I like the look of the handle with the swell center. Now, one downside to the design, in my opinion, is the fact that they have a liner between the blades here. So there's as you can see, a brass liner between the two springs and the two blades. And that probably does make construction a little bit easier to get it to such a nice fit and finish like this. But what it also does is it makes this knife rather thick. So you can see that it is not a thin knife. I'll show you a comparison here to, this is a single bladed Rough Rider, but you can see quite a bit thicker. And so if you're used to single bladed knives, this will feel thick in your pocket. Now, I wouldn't say that it's uncarryable at all, especially depending on where you carry a knife. I personally do more often than not carry a traditional knife in my back right pocket. So it might be a little bit thick for that. You'd be sitting on it and you would feel that definitely in your back pocket. Now, I know a lot of people carry theirs next to their wallet in their front pockets. Or even if you carry your wallet in your back pocket and carry it next to it, you might not notice it as much. So just something to be aware of, that it is pretty thick because of that. And I don't really think they needed that liner to fit the blades in. You can see there's a good amount of space between those blades. And so I do think that they probably could have gotten away with just having the washers against the spring of the other blade. But again, it might be something where it made the construction more consistent. As for the handle material, this is an OD green micarta, and I think that it looks good. It's a kind of natural looking OD green, and I think is comparable to other OD green micarta. Now, as you can tell, it's a nice knife. This knife comes in at a price point of about $50. Actually, now I'm seeing it a little bit less on a different site, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's about $50. I mean, maybe at that site also if you include shipping. So it's right in the price range of case knives. So I'm going to get out a couple different knives to compare this to, and kind of hopefully we can figure out where these Rough Ryder reserves fit within the market. So when we're talking about where these Rough Ryder reserve knives fit within the market, I think there's three main companies that come to mind. And the first, obviously, is Rough Ryder. So it's the main company, and this is a different line of knives within Rough Ryder. The second is Case. So you have Case knives that are sometimes in the same price range as these Rough Ryder reserves, although often Case knives are going to be a little bit higher than the Rough Ryder reserves in price. The third is Gradius from Cutlery. And I think that that was kind of one of the big things that got people interested in these knives, was the fact that they could be a competitor to Gradius from Cutlery. And I actually had Smoky Mountain Knife Works comment on my previous video about the Rough Ryder RRR001, which I will put here so you can pause this if you'd like to read it. They said that it's really, the Rough Ryder Reserve line is a response to the market preferences that they see right now. And I can definitely see that. I want to talk first about how they compare to Rough Ryder. So here is a Rough Ryder Canoe. This is a Canoe pattern, which is kind of the parent pattern for this kayak. And this is the normal Rough Ryder line. So first of all, the pull is not as nice on this knife. It's very light. It does snap, but it's a little bit lazy. As you can see, it has some gaps between the handles and the bolsters. No real big gaps on the back spring here, but slight gaps here and here, as well as just generally a little bit lower quality. It doesn't seem as well put together. It doesn't seem quite as polished and just as well made as the Rough Ryder Reserve. So that's a good comparison, because this knife is more like $15, where this is more like $50. So you do have a big bump in price, but also a big bump in quality. And then on top of the construction quality, this knife has better materials with the OD green micarta and the D2 steel. I didn't mention previously there's D2 steel, but it is. So that's the first comparison. I'm going to talk about this one in a second here. Then we get into case knives. So like I said, case knives are very comparable in price range. Now, certainly people usually throw out the price of $50 to $70 for case knives, and there are certainly lots in those price ranges, but there are ones above that also. I would say that you can find a case knife at the same price range as these Rough Ryder Reserves. So some big differences is the case knives are made in the USA. Now, some similarities here are that the case knives have on-pin shields, glued-only shields, which I personally really dislike. So that's something that's pretty much the same. But you're getting, honestly, in the two that I've seen, and I've seen, this and the one that I have of the Rough Ryder Reserve line, I think that these are a little bit higher quality construction than case knives. I'll give you some examples here. On this case, Barlow, the pins have some gaps between the pins and the handle materials. Not perfect fit on the handle material to the bolsters. The back springs on pretty much every case I've gotten recently, sorry for the flash here, on pretty much every case I've gotten recently have had some gaps. You can see the gaps there. And honestly, case knives, in my experience recently, have been really prone to blade wrap, which doesn't seem to be the case on either of the Rough Rider reserves I've seen so far. So I would say it's just seems a little bit nicer made, nicer put together than the average case knife. So you're getting a little bit higher construction quality, and I'm sure that lots of people will disagree with me on that. But in my experience so far, comparing it to the case knives I have, I think it's a little bit higher quality, and also generally higher quality for the price. When you're talking about materials, you're really not going to get a case knife at $50 with micarta and D2. You're going to get, true sharp steel or carbon vanadium or whatever they call their carbon steel. And so it's just a little bit above that, I think, at a similar price point. Now, the last comparison is Gradius and Cutlery. And there are some good comparisons here. I would say that the action is similar to Gradius and Cutlery action. You get that nice smooth pull and smooth snap, closed and open. The fit between the bolsters and handles is pretty similar, I think. But there is a little bit of a quality difference. I wouldn't really say that this is a direct comparison. I would say that Gradius and Cutlery does have nicer fit and finish. This is a well-used knife, whereas this one I don't believe has been used. This is a well-used knife. It just has better fit and finish out of the box. They have a nicer, I think, feel to them. It's something that's kind of hard to define, but they do have that kind of more put together feel, more classic in a sense, and that might be purposeful with this kayak specifically because it is a modern take on the canoe pattern, but something like that big gap there and the wideness, you wouldn't really see that on a Gradius and Cutlery. So that's some of the places where I think there's a pretty big gulf there between the two. A lot of really classic designs from Gradius and Cutlery executed as they should be, compared to a more modern take and some slight design things that might be better changed. Now, what is the market for Rough Rider reserve knives? Well, I think it depends on the knife. It depends on the pattern. For this knife, I think this is a knife that a person who normally buys case knives can see and find interesting and buy and get a good knife, really well made with good materials for about the same price that they would have paid for case. So I think that's really the main market for this knife. I don't think there are a whole lot of people who are looking for a larger canoe like this coming from the GEC crowd. Certainly there might be just people who are tired of trying to get the latest release and like the fact that these are somewhat limited and won't be run again in the same handle material and model configuration. But I think mostly for this model, it's going to be people who are typically case customers. Now, that's not the case for all of these Rough Rider reserves. So the other Rough Rider reserve here is this RRR001, which is the one-arm jack. And I think the reason why this model is sold out on Smoky Mountain Knife Works, whereas the other two as of earlier today are not, is because this knife corresponds more directly with a highly sought after GEC pattern. So people have come, although these weren't actually that popular when they first came out, at least compared to now, people have come to really look for these one-arm jacks from GEC. And so when Rough Rider Reserve came out with this knife, I think a lot of people who are typically want to be GEC companies, or I'm sorry, not companies, customers, bought this knife as kind of a replacement because it's very difficult to find these, and even when you do, they're extremely expensive. So I think that is one of the market segments that Rough Rider Reserve could be going for and has gotten here. And I wanted to bring out this Rough Rider to talk about that. So recently, Gradius Cutlery announced that they're doing a run of the number 47 Viper. And the number 47 Viper is one of the most sought after patterns from Gradius and Cutlery. I actually don't have one because, as silly as it sounds, I've passed them up the times that I've been able to get them, even on the original run. I do plan to get them and do reviews from this run, so make sure you hit the bell and get notified when I post that. But it's one of the most sought after knives from Gradius and Cutlery, and this run apparently that they're doing is going to be a very small run. So there's going to be a lot of people who want to get one of those knives and aren't able to. So I think that a good, business decision for Rough Ryder Reserve would be to take this knife, which is the Rough Ryder work knife. This one actually doesn't have a model number on it, which is pretty unusual for Rough Ryder. The previous version was the 2038, I think. But to take this model and give it the Rough Ryder Reserve treatment, give it D2 steel, better fit and finish. The original version of this that I got several of them to give them away, and they were not very well done. This one is much better done with this denim and black micarta. But give it D2 steel, give it better fit and finish, a different handle material, and that's going to really get a lot of those people who bought this knife because they couldn't get this knife. And they'll buy this knife because they can't get the GEC Viper. Now, some people I think have a problem with that. They have a problem with maybe Rough Ryder Reserve using this arrow shield, which I talked about earlier, and doing patterns that are similar. I don't, and the reason for that is because these are not things that GEC invented. GEC did not invent this knife. They just made it really well, this one-arm jack. And as you can see, it's not exactly the same. Rough Ryder Reserve did some good stuff in adjusting the pointiness of this catch here. They made the knife a little bit bigger, which I actually kind of like. And they added this easy open notch. So it's not a copy. The Rough Ryder work knife is a little bit closer to being uncomfortably close, I guess, to the GEC Viper with the cut swedge and the nail nick in the cut swedge and the type of bolster. But I think what I would like to see from Rough Ryder Reserve in this space is something between the GEC 47 Viper and this knife, which is pretty much the same size, and the case swayback. The case swayback is quite a bit smaller than, the 47 Viper and this knife. And I'd like to see Rough Ryder Reserve do a knife with a similar design, a little bit between those two, just right between those two different sizes. So a little bit more of a 3.25, or I'm sorry, not 3.25, 3.5 to 3.75 inch. And to give you a reference, this is a 3.5 inch handled knife. So I think if they did that, they would still get a lot of those people who weren't able to purchase a 47 Viper to purchase one, and still be doing their own thing and not completely copying GEC. But I don't necessarily think that that's their whole business model. I think the business model is more so bringing a nice product to the market that maybe fills a niche that isn't quite filled by the traditional pocket knife market right now, or the industry. And bringing that up, I want to talk about this knife, or rather this knife, the company that makes this knife. So this is an A.G. Russell, and I always forget if it's a rancher or a cowboy. I think it's the rancher. And interestingly, I actually won this knife from Darren Orrell, who loaned this knife, the subject of the review. So another thanks to Darren for that. But this is a knife that's an A.G. Russell knife, and there are a lot of similarities in quality and construction to the Rough Ryder Reserve knives. So much so that I wouldn't be surprised, I'm not suggesting it because I don't have enough information to suggest it, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were made by the same company, these two knives. Now, one difference that I like about the A.G. Russell that the Rough Ryder Reserves don't have, I was wondering if they would, is the blade stop in the blade well there. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but there's a blade stop. And the reason I say they're similar is because, again, not very many production traditional knife companies do washers, and these A.G. Russells sometimes do have washers. The shields are not pinned, but they're really well made in general. And I think, interestingly, This is something, these A.G. Russell knives that are in the 50 to 70, 30 to 70 type range, depending on the model, are a really good comparison to these Rough Rider Reserves. Now, I've only had a few of these A.G. Russells. This is the only one I still have, but I do think that it's a pretty good comparison. So if you're familiar with the quality of the A.G. Russell overseas made knives, which are good quality, then that'll give you a good idea of the quality of these Rough Rider Reserves. And I know that this has been kind of a broad conversation that went a little bit off of the specific knife here, this Rough Rider Reserve RRR, 3 R's, 2 zeros, and a 2, the Kayak. But I think it's worth talking about, where these fit in the market. And so I hope it was enlightening to you, gave you a good idea of what you can expect if you do decide to pick one of these up. Now, I mentioned that they are available still. So the Kayak and the Whittler are still available on Smoky Mountain Knife Works as of earlier today. And in my previous video, I mentioned it seems like they were only available on Smoky Mountain Knife Works. I did see that they are on Chicago Knife Works now. So I'm not sure if they're going to be on several different sites or just those two, but they are on Chicago Knife Works for a little less. But again, Chicago Knife Works does their shipping cost a little differently. So just compare the two. And there are more coming out. Apparently, these are supposed to come out in groups of 4. There's another model called the Barback, I believe, Barback, that was supposed to be part of this group, but just is a little bit delayed. And it's a very, very different modern take on a kind of bar knife. And it's interesting. I'm not sure if I'm going to get one, but if I do, I'll definitely do a review. But they're supposed to come out in groups of 4s, and the Kayak and the Whittler are still available, and more will be coming soon. So definitely keep an eye out on them if it's something you're interested in. And if you enjoyed this video, I appreciate you watching, and please do check out my social media, all at Knife Thoughts, my website, knifethoughts.com, where I'll be posting articles and have lots of previous articles. And subscribe here so that you see my other videos, and hit the bell so that you don't miss any. And last but not least, don't forget to go out and do good.